Above the Clouds, The Last Flight That Changed Everything, Chapter 1. The sky doesn't scream. At 22,000 feet, the war was silent. Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Carter had learned that silence was the most dangerous sound of all. The bomber cut through the night sky like a slow, wounded animal, its four engines humming in an uneven rhythm that Jimmy felt more than heard. The cockpit smelled of metal, oil, and sweat, a familiar, comforting stench that meant everything was still working. For now. Below them, clouds stretched endlessly, glowing faintly in the moonlight. They looked soft, innocent, like something you could fall into and disappear forever. Jimmy kept his eyes forward. He didn't trust beauty at this altitude. "Altitude steady," the co-pilot said, his voice flat, tired. Jimmy nodded. Good. They had been in the air for almost 5 hours. 5 hours of darkness, vibration, and waiting. Waiting for flak, waiting for fighters, waiting for the moment when the sky would suddenly decide they didn't belong in it anymore. Jimmy flexed his fingers on the controls. They were stiff, aching slightly. He barely noticed. Pain had become background noise since the war began. He thought of home, not intentionally. Home had a way of sneaking in when you least wanted it. A kitchen table, a radio playing quietly, his mother standing at the sink, pretending not to worry. Don't go there, he told himself. Up here, memory was a liability. Behind him, the crew moved carefully, quietly. Men spoke in half sentences. Jokes were rare tonight. When someone laughed, it came out wrong, too loud, too sharp, and died quickly. This was their 12th mission. Jimmy knew the number by heart. He knew what it meant. He had seen empty bunks, had seen crews fail to return, their names quietly erased from the board like they had never existed at all. He swallowed. Just fly the plane. That was the rule. That was how you survived. You didn't think about where you were going or what you were carrying in the bomb bay beneath your feet. You didn't think about the people below. You flew. Suddenly the intercom crackled. Flak ahead. Heavy. Jimmy's jaw tightened. The silence broke. Black bursts tore through the sky ahead, violent flowers blooming and dying in seconds. The bomber shuddered as the first shock wave rolled through it. "Hold her steady," someone shouted. "I am," Jimmy snapped, knuckles whitening. The sky no longer looked peaceful. It never had been. Chapter 2. Before he knew the sky could kill, Texas had smelled like dust, gasoline, and heat. Jimmy remembered that clearly. The sun had beaten down on the training airfield like it was trying to burn doubt out of them. Rows of young men stood laughing, sweating through their uniforms, convinced they were invincible simply because they had been chosen to fly. Jimmy had been one of them. Back then, the sky meant freedom. The first time he'd taken a plane up alone, his hands had shaken so badly he thought the instructor would pull him back down. But once the wheels left the ground, once the earth fell away, something inside him had gone quiet. Up there, things made sense. "You make a mistake up there," his instructor had said, leaning against the wing, cigarette dangling from his mouth, "and the sky doesn't forgive you." Jimmy had smiled. He thought that was a figure of speech. At night, in the barracks, the men talked about what they'd do when the war was over. Cars, women, college, life picking up exactly where it had left off. Jimmy had written letters home, full of confidence and half-truths. "Don't worry," he'd written. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." He believed it then. The memory faded as another explosion rocked the bomber. "Engine 3 took a hit," someone yelled. Jimmy pulled the yoke gently, compensating. feeling the aircraft resist him like a living thing. "Stay with me," he muttered, to the plane, to himself, to whatever still cared enough to listen. The sky didn't scream. It just waited. Chapter 3: The First Time You Don't Come Back the Same. The flak didn't stop all at once. It never did. It came in waves, like the sky was testing them, probing for weakness. Jimmy felt the bomber shudder again, harder this time. A deep metallic groan traveled through the fuselage, the kind of sound that made every man on board hold his breath at the same moment. "Control cables are holding," the engineer said, his voice tight. Jimmy nodded, eyes locked on the artificial horizon. The needle wavered slightly. He corrected without thinking. Muscle memory. Training. Fear packed so deep it had turned into instinct. "Stay in formation," came the radio call. Another crew, somewhere to their left. Jimmy glanced out the side window. Through a tear in the clouds, he saw a bomber trailing smoke falling behind. One engine burned bright orange, too bright, like a warning flare. He watched it for a second longer than he should have. "Jimmy," the co-pilot said quietly, "I see it." They all did. The burning plane dipped lower, nose angling down as if bowing to something unseen. Parachutes bloomed in the air, white flowers against the darkness. Then the bomber disappeared into the clouds. No explosion. No sound. Just gone. Jimmy forced his eyes forward. This was the part no one prepared you for. How quickly the sky erased people. One moment they were beside you, voices in your headset laughing about something stupid. The next, they were just empty air. "Bomb bay doors opening," the bombardier called. Jimmy felt the plane shift as the doors yawned open beneath them. Cold air rushed in, sharp and invasive. "Steady," Jimmy said, though his voice sounded distant to his own ears. Below them, the target appeared through a break in the clouds. Rail yards. Long lines of steel gleaming faintly. A city wrapped around them, lights dimmed, pretending to sleep. 10 seconds. Jimmy's stomach tightened. He told himself the same lie every time. If we don't do it, someone else will. The bombs released. The plane lurched upward, suddenly lighter. Jimmy pulled gently, easing them away from the target. Somewhere far below, the night would soon stop being quiet. They turned for home. Only later, hours later, when the English coast finally appeared, did Jimmy realize his hands were shaking. Chapter 4. Empty bunks. The airfield smelled wrong when they landed. Not smoke, not fuel, absence. Jimmy climbed down from the cockpit on stiff legs, boots hitting the tarmac harder than usual. He stood there for a moment, letting the engines wind down, listening as the familiar roar faded into a hollow silence. Ground crew rushed in. Mechanics shouted. Someone slapped him on the shoulder, grinning, shouting something he couldn't hear. Jimmy nodded automatically. Inside the barracks, the noise dropped. Men moved more slowly here. Quieter. Helmets were set down gently, like they might break if handled too roughly. Jimmy walked past the bunks. One was empty, then another, then another. No gear, no letters, no boots under the frame, just bare metal and neatly folded blankets that no one would ever unfold again. He stopped at one bunk and stared. He couldn't remember the man's name at first. That scared him more than anything. Later, lying on his own bunk, Jimmy stared at the ceiling as voices murmured around him. Someone laughed too loudly. Someone else told a joke that didn't land. Jimmy didn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the burning plane slipping into the clouds. Chapter 5. Letters You Never Send. The next morning, Jimmy sat at a small wooden desk with a piece of paper in front of him. "Dear Mom." He stared at the words. His pen hovered. What could he say that wouldn't be a lie? That he was fine? That flying still felt like freedom? That the sky hadn't started to feel like a trap? He crossed out the line, crumpled the paper. Around him, other men wrote, some with steady hands, some stopping every few seconds to stare at nothing. Jimmy tried again. "Dear Mom, I'm still here." That was true. He folded the letter without adding anything else and slipped it into his pocket instead of the envelope. Some truths were too heavy to mail. Chapter 6. The Space Between Missions. Time between missions stretched and twisted. Hours felt like days. Days collapsed into moments. Jimmy learned to measure life in smaller units. How long the engines took to warm. How many cigarettes burned between briefings. How many men answered roll call. He stopped looking at the mission board. Numbers felt like curses. At night, he lay awake listening to the wind rattle the barracks windows. Somewhere beyond the walls, planes took off and landed, an endless cycle that didn't care who was ready. Sometimes he imagined not hearing his name at briefing. The thought terrified him. Flying scared him. Not flying scared him more. Chapter 7. The Day the Sky Turned Heavy. The weather briefing didn't scare anyone. That should have. Cloud cover, low visibility, possible icing, nothing they hadn't flown through before. The room smelled like stale coffee and damp wool. Men standing shoulder to shoulder, listening with half their attention while the rest of their minds stayed somewhere else. Anywhere else. Jimmy sat near the back, hands folded, eyes on the map. The red line of their route cut straight through a gray mass marked simply as unpredictable conditions. He'd learned that those were the worst words in aviation. Unpredictable meant the sky had choices. The engines roared to life an hour later, shaking the ground beneath their boots. The bomber felt heavier than usual as it rolled down the runway, slow to lift, reluctant. When the wheels finally left the earth, Jimmy felt a brief tightening in his chest, something like regret, gone before he could name it. Clouds swallowed them within minutes. Thick, gray, endless. Visibility dropped to nothing. The horizon vanished. The world outside the cockpit became a shifting wall of white and shadow, the aircraft buffeted by unseen hands. Turbulence hit hard. The bomber lurched violently, metal groaning, the wings flexing in ways Jimmy didn't like to imagine too closely. "Easy," he muttered, more to himself than the plane. "Easy." Ice began forming on the edges of the windshield, thin at first, then thicker. The engines strained, their steady rhythm breaking into something uneven. That's when the sound changed. Not an explosion. A deep, sickening thud. The kind of sound you feel in your spine. Chapter 8. When Control Slips. The left wing dipped sharply. Warning lights flickered. "Engine 3's losing power," the flight engineer said, voice tight but controlled. "Oil pressure's dropping fast." Jimmy's hands moved automatically, correcting, compensating, fighting physics with muscle memory and stubbornness. "Feather it," he said. "Now." The bomber shuddered again, losing altitude in slow, terrifying increments. Outside, the clouds seemed closer now, pressing in, as if the sky itself were leaning down to watch. The co-pilot glanced at the instruments, then at Jimmy. "We're not climbing," he said quietly. Jimmy knew. Every pilot knew that moment. The instant when the plane stopped being a machine you controlled and became something you negotiated with. He thought of training, of instructors yelling, of checklists memorized by heart. None of it covered this exact feeling, the feeling that the sky had decided. "We need to turn back," someone said over the intercom. Jimmy hesitated. Turning meant fighting the wind, fighting the ice, fighting the failing engine. But pushing forward meant pretending nothing was wrong. He made the call. "Turning south," he said, slow and steady. The bomber resisted, groaning as it banked. Ice cracked loose from the wings, spinning away into nothingness. Then came the second hit, harder. The aircraft dropped sharply, men shouting as gravity suddenly meant something else entirely. Jimmy's heart slammed against his ribs. This wasn't turbulence. This was damage. Chapter 9. The decision no one trains for altitude bled away. Not fast enough to panic, but too fast to ignore. Jimmy scanned the instruments, jaw clenched, mind racing through options that narrowed by the second. The engines fought, but they were tired. The plane was tired. So was he. "Captain," the navigator said, voice barely above a whisper. "If we lose any more altitude—" "I know," Jimmy cut in. Below them, the clouds thinned. The ground came into view in fragments. Dark fields, narrow roads, patches of forest. Not friendly territory. Not a place marked on any map he'd studied. The truth settled in quietly. They weren't making it back. Jimmy took a breath. "All right," he said into the intercom, his voice steady despite everything. "Listen to me. We're putting her down. Gear won't deploy. This is going to be rough." No one spoke. They didn't need to. "We do this together," Jimmy continued. "Stay strapped in. Follow commands. We walk away from this." He didn't say if we're lucky. The bomber descended in a long, controlled glide, engines screaming in protest. Jimmy's entire world narrowed to airspeed, angle, timing. The ground rushed up. Impact came like the world breaking in half. Metal screamed. Something exploded. The plane skidded violently, tearing through earth and grass, throwing men against their restraints. Then, stillness. Jimmy sat frozen, hands still gripping the controls, breath coming in shallow gasps. "Sound off," he said. One by one, voices answered, shaken, hurt, alive. Jimmy closed his eyes for just a second, not in prayer, in gratitude. Chapter 10. On the wrong side of the war. They didn't linger. Fuel leaked from the torn fuselage, the smell sharp and dangerous. Jimmy helped pull men free, shouting, pushing, adrenaline carrying him when strength should have failed. They moved away from the wreckage, crouching in tall grass as smoke began to rise behind them. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Jimmy's ears strained for engines, shouting, anything. Nothing came. Minutes stretched. The sky above was suddenly calm, indifferent again, as if it hadn't nearly killed them an hour earlier. Jimmy sat on the ground, back against a tree, hands trembling now that there was nothing left to do. He looked at his crew, muddy, shaken, breathing hard, and felt something heavy settle in his chest. Responsibility, not for flying them here, for bringing them back alive. Footsteps approached. Rifles appeared through the trees. American voices followed. Relief didn't explode. It seeped in slowly, painfully, like warmth returning to numb fingers. Jimmy stayed seated long after it was safe to stand. He knew something had changed. Not the war. Him. Chapter 11. The ground stays with you. They told Jimmy he was lucky. That word followed him everywhere after the crash. Lucky the fuel didn't ignite. Lucky the Germans hadn't reached them first. Lucky everyone walked away. Jimmy nodded every time someone said it, because that was easier than explaining the truth. The truth was that the ground stayed with him. Not in dreams exactly. Not yet. But in his body. In the way his legs felt heavier when he walked. In the way his hands tightened around a coffee cup like it might suddenly fall away. At night, lying in his bunk, he could still feel the moment of impact. The instant where gravity changed its mind. The sound of metal screaming as the earth tore at the plane. He hadn't screamed. That bothered him. Men talked in low voices around him, trading versions of the crash like stories passed down around a fire. Each retelling smoothed the edges a little, made it cleaner, more heroic. Jimmy didn't add his version. His version had no hero in it. Just a man holding a control yoke, thinking, this is how it ends. Chapter 12. Orders don't ask how you feel. The medical officer cleared him in less than a week. No concussion, no fractures, the doctor said, tapping a clipboard. You're good to fly. Jimmy opened his mouth, then closed it. He wanted to say that his chest felt tight whenever he heard engines now, that his stomach turned at the sound of metal flexing, that when he closed his eyes, he didn't see clouds anymore. He saw ground rushing up to meet him. But none of that fit on the clipboard. Good, he said instead. Back in the briefing room, the air felt thicker, closer. The walls seemed to lean inward as officers spoke about targets and routes and weather patterns like they were discussing train schedules. Jimmy stared at the map. Another mission. Another red line through enemy territory. His name was still on the board. That scared him more than if it hadn't been. After the briefing, Sergeant Collins clapped him lightly on the shoulder. Heard about the crash, he said. Hell of a thing. Jimmy nodded. Yeah. You good? Jimmy met his eyes. That question wasn't about injuries. Yeah, he said again. Collins studied him for a second longer, then nodded and walked away. Jimmy exhaled slowly. Lying had become easier. Chapter 13. The longest takeoff. The engine sounded wrong the next morning. Not actually wrong, just louder, closer, like they were inside his chest instead of outside the plane. Jimmy sat in the cockpit, hands resting on his knees, breathing slowly. He focused on small details, the scratches on the instrument panel, the worn edge of the throttle, the faint smell of oil. You've done this before, he told himself. You'll do it again. The bomber began to roll. The runway stretched ahead of them, longer than Jimmy remembered. For a brief, terrifying second, he imagined the wheels never lifting. Imagined the plane shuddering, failing, tearing itself apart before they ever left the ground. Speed's good, the co-pilot said. Jimmy nodded, though his throat felt tight. Rotate. He pulled back gently. The ground fell away. Jimmy's heart didn't slow. Altitude climbed. 1,000 feet, 2, 5. Only when the air smoothed out, when the bomber settled into its steady, familiar rhythm, did Jimmy realize his jaw ached from clenching it so hard. He had made it past the first test. He wasn't relieved. He was angry. Angry that fear still had this much power over him. Angry that the sky, the thing he'd loved most, had turned into something that demanded payment every time he touched it. Chapter 14. What you carry up there. Midway through the flight, flak appeared again. Distant at first, then closer. Black bursts blooming like bruises against the sky. Jimmy felt the old reflexes kick in, corrections, commands, calm voice. On the surface, he was the same pilot he'd always been. Inside, something different stirred. Not panic. Resolve. If the sky wanted something from him, it would have to work harder for it this time. A burst rocked the bomber, close enough to rattle teeth. Someone swore. Someone laughed nervously. Jimmy held them steady. Below them, the clouds parted, revealing the world in fragments. Rivers, towns, roads leading somewhere no one on this plane would ever see. For a moment, Jimmy felt something unexpected. Sadness, not for himself, for everyone below who would never know how close death passed above their heads, carried by men just as scared as they were. The bombs released, the plane lifted, and Jimmy realized, with a strange clarity, that fear hadn't disappeared. He had just learned how to fly with it. Chapter 15, The Last Mission. They told them it would be the last one. No one celebrated. Men had heard that before. Promises floated easily in wartime. Still, something about the tone felt different this time. Less urgency, less desperation. Jimmy studied the briefing map, noticing how his hands no longer shook. Fear was still there, but it no longer owned him. It sat beside him now, like a passenger who'd learned to stay quiet. The flight was smooth, clear skies, almost gentle. Halfway to the target, the radio crackled. Enemy fighters spotted. Jimmy felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Then something unexpected. Calm. He guided the bomber with steady hands, trusting his crew, trusting himself. When flak came, it felt distant, almost tired. Like the war itself was running out of strength. They dropped their payload cleanly. No damage, no losses. As they turned back toward England, the clouds opened, sunlight spilling across the wings in wide golden bands. Jimmy smiled. Not because they'd survived, because for the first time in a long while, the sky didn't feel angry. Chapter 16, When the War Lets Go, the announcement came quietly. No sirens, no cheers at first, just a radio broadcast crackling through the barracks. The war in Europe was over. Men stared at one another, unsure how to react. Then someone laughed. Someone cried. Someone just sat down hard on the floor, like their legs had finally given up. Jimmy stepped outside. The air felt different, lighter, like the world had been holding its breath and finally let it go. Planes still sat on the runway. Engines cooled. Wings rested. For the first time, no one was waiting to climb into them. Chapter 17, Coming Back to Earth Home didn't look the way Jimmy remembered. Or maybe he was the one who'd changed. The streets were brighter, louder. People smiled easily, as if the war had been something distant, like a bad storm that passed without touching them. His mother cried when she saw him, held his face in her hands like she was checking to make sure he was real. "You're safe," she kept saying. Jimmy nodded. "Yes," he said. And for once, it felt true. At night, he still dreamed, still woke sometimes with his heart racing. But the dreams softened. The crash faded. The fear loosened its grip. He went back to flying, not bombers, not war machines, small planes, mail runs, quiet skies. The first time he lifted off again, just for himself, he felt something open inside his chest. Joy. Simple, honest, unarmed. Chapter 18, Above the Clouds. Years later, Jimmy stood beside a small airstrip, watching a plane climb into the afternoon sky. Someone asked him once if the war ruined flying for him. He shook his head. "No," he said. "It taught me why it matters." The sky was still vast, still dangerous, still beautiful. But it no longer demanded payment. As the plane disappeared into the clouds, Jimmy smiled softly. He had faced the sky at its worst, and it had finally given him peace in return. If this story stayed with you, if it made you stop for a moment and breathe a little slower, then take a second now. Leave a like. It helps stories like this reach people who need them. Subscribe if you want more quiet, meaningful stories about courage, survival, and what comes after the battle. And if you know someone who loves aviation, or someone who served, or someone who's still finding their way back to peace, share this story with them. Because some stories aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to be passed on. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next story.